Imagine two neighbors who agree to trade lawn tools. One charges the other $10 every time he borrows the lawnmower, but only gets charged $1 when he borrows his neighbor's ladder. That's not really a fair trade, even if both sides technically agreed to it. For decades, something similar was happening between the United States and many of its trading partners. And in 2025, the US government tried to fix it in a way that ended up sparking a legal battle all the way to the Supreme Court. Here's the full story, broken down step by step. A tariff is just a tax. When a company in the US wants to buy something made in another country, like shoes from Vietnam or steel from Brazil, the US government can charge an extra fee on that purchase. That fee is the tariff, and it usually makes the product more expensive for whoever's buying it here in the US. Every country in the world does this. It's normal. The real question is, how much does each country charge, and is it fair? That question gets at the heart of the problem. For a long time, the US kept its tariffs pretty low. On average, before 2025, only about 2 to 3% extra on most imported goods. Meanwhile, a lot of other countries charged way more on American products going into their countries. Think of it like a seesaw that's supposed to be balanced, but isn't. If you wanted to sell an American-made motorcycle in India, India might charge a tax of 100% or more on it, basically doubling the price for Indian buyers. But if someone wanted to sell an Indian motorcycle here in the US, America might only charge a small fraction of that. Same story with cars in the EU, that stands for European Union. The group of 27 countries in Europe that trade together, like France, Germany, and Italy, the EU charged roughly 10% on imported cars, while the US only charged 2.5%. So American companies trying to sell overseas kept running into big tax walls, while companies from other countries had an easier time selling into the US. That's the unfair part people were upset about. It wasn't a level playing field. Because of that imbalance, in 2025 the US government said, "Enough of this. We're going to charge other countries roughly what they charge us." This became known as reciprocal tariffs. Reciprocal simply means mutual or matching back, like returning a favor. Here's how they figured out the tariff rate for each country. And this part is important. They didn't actually go country by country and check what tariff each one charged on US goods. Instead, they used a shortcut formula based on the trade deficit. A deficit just means a gap or shortfall. In this case, the difference between how much the US buys from a country versus how much it sells back to them. The formula was, take the US trade deficit with a country, divide it by how much the US imports from that country, then divide that by 2. So if the US bought a lot more from a country than it sold to them, that country got hit with a bigger tariff, even if that country's actual tax rates on American goods weren't necessarily that high. Using this method, tariffs on more than 60 countries ranged anywhere from 10% all the way up to 145%. Some of the highest tariffs the US has used in almost 100 years. That shortcut is exactly what caused a big problem, and it's worth pausing on why. A trade deficit is not the same thing as an unfair tariff. A trade deficit just means the US buys more from a country than it sells to them. And that can happen for lots of totally normal reasons that have nothing to do with unfair taxes. Maybe that country makes things cheaper, like clothing or electronics. Maybe Americans just want to buy more of what they sell, like oil. Or maybe it's about currency values, not tariffs at all. So using the trade deficit as the way to calculate fairness was like blaming the scoreboard for the outcome of the game instead of looking at how the game was actually played. Trade economists across the political spectrum criticize this approach for mixing up trade deficits with actual tariff fairness. That criticism turned out to matter a great deal because the courts got involved next. On February 20th, 2026, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 6-3, meaning 6 judges agreed, 3 disagreed. that the law the government used to create these tariffs didn't actually give the president the power to impose tariffs this way. That law is called IEPA, which stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, a law originally written to let the president act quickly during real emergencies, like freezing the money of a hostile foreign government, not for everyday trade policy. So the Supreme Court basically said, you used the wrong tool for this job, and that struck down most of these reciprocal tariffs. A few days after that ruling, on February 24th, 2026, the government replaced the old system with a simpler, flatter 10% tariff on imports from almost every country, using a different legal authority called Section 122. This refers to a specific section of an older U.S. trade law that gives the president more limited, temporary power to impose tariffs. Think of it like a different rulebook than IEPA, one that's actually meant for trade situations. Picture it like swapping out a complicated, lopsided pricing chart for one flat sticker price that applies, mostly, to everybody. This flat 10% tariff was originally meant to be temporary, expiring around July 24th, 2026. Even with that change, a few key things are still true right now. Most countries face that flat 10% baseline tariff, but China is the exception. It still faces the highest tariffs of any country the U.S. trades with, mainly because it has separate tariffs called Section 301 duties, another section of trade law. This one specifically used to penalize countries for unfair trade practices like stealing technology or ideas. Duties is just another word for tariffs that survived the Supreme Court ruling even though the reciprocal ones didn't. On top of that, steel, aluminum, and cars have their own separate 25% tariffs that apply no matter what country they come from. And the legal fight isn't over. Courts are still hearing arguments about whether even this new flat tariff is legal. There are also new investigations into whether countries are using forced labor, which could add even more tariffs on top for some nations. Put simply, for years some countries taxed American products more heavily than America taxed theirs, a real and legitimate complaint. In 2025, the U.S. tried to fix this by matching tariffs back at other countries. But the math they used, based on trade deficits rather than actual foreign tariff rates, was flawed and controversial. The Supreme Court then said the legal authority used to do this wasn't valid, so it got replaced with a simpler flat 10% tax on most imports, while special, separate tariffs remain on things like Chinese goods, steel, and cars, and the legal battles over all of this are still playing out in 2026. Hello, this is Dr. San Jose, and thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you like the information or have comments, please share with us your thoughts, feelings, or ideas. Thank you, and God bless. Disclaimer: the videos and articles we produce are based on thoughts, ideas, and information shared with us by viewers from around the world, and they reflect those viewers' personal views and experiences, not necessarily the views of Dr. San Jose or this channel. We do our best to verify the information we share and believe it to be reliable at the time of writing. However, we do not independently verify, endorse, or guarantee its accuracy, completeness, or reliability, and we assume no liability for any loss, harm, or damages arising from its use. If you discover a discrepancy, please leave a comment and let us know. If you have thoughts, ideas, or information you'd like to share with the world, please send them to drsanjose@yahoo.com. This video is provided for entertainment, informational, and inspirational purposes only and is not intended as medical, legal, financial, or professional advice. Please use your own judgment and consult a qualified professional where appropriate.